Leave her. The winter will take the week. The alpha's voice was a whip crack in the freezing air, void of any mercy. Ariana lay in the snowbank, her breath misting violently, her fingers already numb. Above her, the sneering faces of her birth pack blurred against the violent gray sky. She has no parents, no mate, no value, the Luna added, turning her back. Let the mountain claim the orphaned Omega. The crunch of their boots faded into the howling wind. Ariana closed her eyes, trembling as the bitter frost sank its teeth into her bones. She was entirely alone, and she was going to die. The cold was not a simple absence of heat. It was a living, breathing predator. It gnawed at Ariana's extremities, chewing through the thin, frayed fabric of her tunic and sinking deep into her marrow. Every gasp she took was a throatful of glass, tearing at her lungs, while the relentless blizzard whipped her long, dark hair across her face like icy lashes. She dragged her body forward, inches at a time, her torn knees leaving a faint trail of crimson in the pristine, unforgiving white. The blood froze almost instantly. Crystallized rubies left as a testament to her suffering. To be an Omega was to be the heart of a pack, the peacemaker, the gentle soul that bound the fiercer wolves together. But to be an orphaned Omega in the blood iron pack was a curse. Without a family to shield her, she had become a servant, an afterthought, and finally, a scapegoat when the winter grew too harsh and the food stores dwindled. They had marched her to the border of the dead peaks, stripped her of her winter cloak, and left her for the snow. Her inner wolf, usually a quiet, timid presence, whimpered in the dark recesses of her mind. It was too weak to force a shift. To turn into her wolf form now, with so little energy, would tear her heart apart. She was trapped in her frail human skin, at the mercy of the gale. The forest around her was a cathedral of ice. Towering pines bowed under the weight of the snow, their dark needles frosted into jagged daggers. The wind shrieked through the branches, a chaotic chorus that drowned out the frantic, fluttering beat of her own heart. Just close your eyes, a treacherous, soft voice whispered in her mind. Just sleep. It will be warm soon. She knew the lie. She had seen wolves freeze before. The paradoxical warmth was the final stage, the moment the brain surrendered to the frost. But the temptation was overwhelming. Her muscles seized, violently spazzing as her core temperature plummeted. She collapsed against the base of a massive oak, the rough bark scraping her cheek. The snow began to pile over her legs, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her vision narrowed, the edges of the world bleeding into a soft, hazy gray. The pain in her fingers and toes vanished, replaced by a terrifying, hollow numbness. She stared out into the endless expanse of white, watching the snowflakes dance in the twilight. It was almost beautiful, she thought dully, a peaceful way to slip away, far from the cruel hands and sharper fangs of those who had despised her. Then, the wind shifted. Through the overpowering scent of ozone and frost, something else carried on the breeze. It was a scent so potent, so deeply rooted in the earth, that it made Ariana's sluggish pulse spike. Crushed pine needles, wood smoke, and the dark, ozone-heavy scent of an impending thunderstorm. It was an alpha scent, but it possessed a gravity unlike any she had ever encountered. The alphas of her pack smelled of blood and aggression. This scent was ancient, vast, and terrifyingly calm. The snowdrifts ahead of her seemed to part. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the tree line. Ariana forced her heavy eyelids up. Through the swirling white, a beast emerged. It was a wolf of impossible proportions, its shoulders easily clearing the height of a grown man's chest. Its fur was the color of the abyss, absorbing the faint moonlight, a stark, violent contrast to the snow. But it was the eyes that paralyzed her. They were molten gold, glowing with an internal, fierce intelligence. The giant wolf did not stalk toward her. It walked with a slow, deliberate grace, every step a statement of absolute dominion over the frozen world. The blizzard seemed to break around it, the winds curving away from its massive form. Ariana's breath hitched. A feral predator. This was how it would end. Not by the slow sleep of the snow, but by the jaws of a rogue beast. She tried to push herself back against the tree, a pathetic attempt to escape, but her limbs were useless blocks of ice. The wolf stopped mere inches from her. The heat radiating off its massive body was a physical shock, a wall of pure, blistering warmth hitting her freezing skin. The beast lowered its massive head, its wet nose hovering over her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite, her heart hammering a frantic, final rhythm against her ribs. Instead, she felt a huff of hot air against her frozen cheek. The golden eyes held hers for a fraction of a second, an eternity suspended in the storm. In those eyes, she saw no hunger, no cruelty. She saw a quiet, devastating storm. A heavy, unnatural crackle of bone and muscle filled the air, the sound of a shift. Ariana's vision finally gave out, the blackness rushing in to claim her. But in her final moment of consciousness, the shadow of the beast morphed. A man's hand, large, calloused, and radiating incredible heat, reached out through the darkness. The last thing she felt before the world faded away was the terrifying, undeniable sensation of being lifted from the ice and cradled against a chest as solid as a mountain. Firelight. It was the first thing her mind registered, bleeding through her closed eyelids in shades of violent orange and soft amber. Then came the heat. It was thick, heavy, and intoxicating. It seeped into her skin, thawing the marrow in her bones, chasing away the phantom frost that still clung to her mind. Ariana gasped, her eyes flying open. Her body jerked upward, driven by pure survival instinct. But a sudden wave of dizziness forced her back down into a sea of agonizing softness. She was lying on a massive bed, buried beneath layers of heavy, impossibly soft direwolf furs. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through the warmth. Where am I? She scanned the room, her breath coming in short, terrified bursts. It was a vast chamber built of dark, rough-hewn stone. A massive hearth dominated the far wall, a roaring fire consuming thick logs of cedar and pine. High above, arched windows revealed the pitch-black night, swirling with the same relentless snow that had nearly killed her. But she was safe. She was dry. She was dressed in an oversized shirt of spun gray wool that smelled overwhelmingly of him. The scent hit her again: wood smoke, deep forest pine, and the electric ozone of a storm. It was the scent of the golden-eyed beast. Her inner wolf stirred. It did not cower. It did not press its belly to the floor in submission, as it always did around alphas. Instead, it paced nervously, curiously, drawn to the heavy, saturating aura in the room. A shadow shifted in the corner. Ariana froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the furs, pulling them up to her chin. He stepped into the firelight. He was the human echo of the beast she had seen in the snow. Tall, impossibly tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the hearth. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling just past his ears, slightly unkempt. He wore dark trousers and a simple, unlaced tunic that revealed the hard, scarred planes of his chest. But it was his face that stole the breath from her lungs. It was forged from severe, aristocratic lines. A sharp jaw, a straight nose, and eyes that reflected the fire. They were no longer the molten gold of the wolf, but a striking, icy storm gray. He possessed a terrifying stillness. When he moved toward the bed, he made absolutely no sound. No creak of the floorboards, no rustle of fabric. He was a phantom of muscle and lethal grace. Ariana pressed herself backward, her heart thrashing. An omega in a strange alpha's territory. She knew the laws. She was unclaimed property. A toy. A prisoner. He stopped a few feet from the bed. He did not loom over her. He did not project his dominance to force her head down, a common cruelty among alphas. He simply stood there, a bowl of steaming liquid in his hands, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You are awake." His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, vibrating through the stone floor and settling heavily in her chest. It was the kind of voice that commanded armies, a voice that the earth itself would obey. Ariana tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. She managed only a pathetic, raspy squeak, coughing weakly as her dry vocal cords protested. The man's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. "Do not speak. Your throat is raw from the frost." He sat on the very edge of the massive mattress. The mattress barely dipped under his immense weight, a testament to the coiled control in his body. He extended the wooden bowl toward her. "Drink. It is venison broth. It will restore your core." Ariana stared at the bowl, then at his hand. His knuckles were bruised, his skin scarred with the silver lines of old battles. She was terrified to take it, terrified to bridge the physical gap between them. Omegas did not take from alphas unless ordered. Omegas served. Seeing her hesitation, the storm gray of his eyes darkened. He did not snap at her. He did not force the bowl to her lips. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the bowl on the heavy wooden nightstand beside the bed. He pulled his hand back, resting his forearms on his thighs, giving her space. "I am Roger," he said, his voice dropping an octave, softening into a tone that felt entirely out of place for a creature of his size. "Alpha of the Winterborn, you are in my citadel." The Winterborn. Ariana's blood ran cold despite the furs. They were the myths of the North, the ancient pack that ruled the frozen peaks, untouched by the petty politics of the lowland packs. And their leader was not just an alpha. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. She was in the den of the most lethal shifter on the continent. Trembling, she slowly reached out from beneath the furs, her scarred, delicate fingers wrapping around the warm wooden bowl. She brought it to her lips and drank. The broth was rich and savory, a burst of life rushing through her starved veins. When she lowered the bowl, she found his eyes fixed on her hands, specifically on the faded, crescent-shaped scars on her wrists, the bite marks of her former pack members, punishing her for perceived slights. A low, dangerous vibration filled the room. It took Ariana a moment to realize it was a growl, vibrating deep within Roger's chest. The sound was so primal, so full of ancient violence, that she flinched, curling into a ball and squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. The growl snapped off instantly. A heavy silence fell. Ariana peeked through her lashes. Roger had not moved toward her. Instead, his hands were gripped tightly into fists, his knuckles white, restraining his own fury. "Who?" he whispered, the word laced with a dangerous, lethal calm. "Left you to the ice." By the next evening, Ariana had recovered enough to stand, though her legs trembled beneath her like a newborn fawn's. The citadel was a fortress of solitude, carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. It was vast, echoing, and intimidatingly quiet. She had learned quickly that the king's wolves were deeply disciplined. A few servants, betas with gentle eyes, had brought her fresh clothes, a dress of deep crimson wool, far finer than anything she had ever touched, and soft leather boots. They spoke in hushed tones, averting their eyes, treating her with a bizarre reverence she couldn't comprehend. But underneath the quiet respect, Ariana's enhanced hearing picked up the whispers. "She smells of the blood iron. She bears their mark." The king brought her past the threshold. An outcast. It violates the treaty. They will come for her. It means war. Ariana stood by the arched window of her chamber, looking out over the jagged moonlit peaks. The wind howled against the glass, a constant reminder of the death she had narrowly escaped. She was a catalyst for war. The Blood Iron Pack was proud and vicious. Even though they had cast her out to die, the laws of shifter kind were rigid. An Omega belonged to her birth pack until she was mated. For another Alpha to take her into his territory was an act of theft, an insult to their sovereignty. They would use her as an excuse to challenge the Winterborn. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She had survived the snow, only to bring destruction to the man who had saved her. Roger's dark, storm-gray eyes flashed in her mind. He had shown her the only kindness she had ever known. She could not repay him with war. She had to leave. Wrapping a heavy woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders, Ariana slipped out of her chamber. The stone corridors were dimly lit by iron sconces, casting long, flickering shadows. She moved silently, using the skills of evasion she had perfected over years of avoiding her cruel packmates. The cold of the citadel halls bit at her cheeks, a stark contrast to the blazing hearth in her room. She navigated the labyrinthine passages, moving instinctively downward, toward the scent of fresh snow and freedom. She reached the grand foyer. The massive oak doors, reinforced with black iron, stood at the end of the hall. Beyond them lay the freezing night. It would mean certain death to walk back into the storm, but it was better than watching the Winterborn bleed for a worthless Omega. She took a step toward the doors. "The snow is heavier tonight than yesterday," Ariana gasped, spinning around. Roger stood at the base of the grand, curving staircase. He was cloaked in shadows, a dark silhouette against the pale stone. He wore a heavy mantle of black fur over his shoulders, the physical manifestation of his royal authority. He looked like a god of winter, immovable and terrifying. Ariana's voice faltered. She took a step back, instinctively lowering her chin in submission. I must go. I am a burden, a breach of the law. Roger slowly descended the final few steps, stepping into the moonlight that spilled through the high clerestory windows. The magnetic pull of his presence hit her like a physical force. Her breath hitched, her inner wolf whined, clawing at her chest, desperate to close the distance between them. The law of the lowlands holds no power in my mountains, Roger said, his voice a soft, dangerous rumble. He closed the distance between them with predatory slowness, stopping just a few feet away. They will come for me, she whispered, tears burning the corners of her eyes. My old pack. They will demand me back, or they will wage war. I am not worth the blood of your people, Alpha. Roger's gaze dropped to her trembling lips, then rose to meet her eyes. The intensity in his stare stripped the breath from her lungs. There was a storm brewing in those gray depths, a fiercely possessive fire that made her pulse race uncontrollably. They threw you away, he said quietly. They fed you to the ice. Because I am nothing, she cried out, the years of abuse and self-loathing finally breaking past her walls. I am a broken, orphaned Omega. I have nothing to offer a king. The silence that followed was deafening. Ariana squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for his agreement, waiting for him to open the heavy oak doors and cast her back into the dark. Instead, she heard the heavy rustle of his mantle. She opened her eyes and gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Roger, the Alpha King of the Winterborn, the most feared predator in the Northern Territories, had stepped down from his dominating height. He lowered himself, his knee hitting the cold stone floor with a soft thud. He was kneeling before her. He looked up at her, their faces now perfectly level. The terrifying power he possessed was completely retracted, leaving only a raw, devastating vulnerability in his eyes. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently grasping her trembling fingers. The heat of his skin sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to her heart. You are not nothing, he vowed, his voice a fierce, vibrating whisper that settled deep into her very soul. The moment the snow laid you at my feet, you became everything. Before Ariana could process the sheer weight of his words, a sound pierced the heavy stone of the citadel. It was a howl, high, sharp, and echoing from the valley below. Then another joined it, and another. The Blood Iron Pack had arrived at the borders. The war had come to the mountain. The sound of the Blood Iron war horns tore through the tranquility of the citadel like jagged iron. It was a dissonant, ugly noise, reeking of arrogance and cheap steel. Roger did not flinch. He slowly rose from his knee, the vulnerability in his storm-gray eyes instantly freezing over into something ancient and absolute. He did not let go of Ariana's hand. Instead, his grip tightened just enough to anchor her, his thumb dragging in a slow, soothing arc across her scarred knuckles. Stay within the walls, he commanded, his voice devoid of the gentle warmth it had held seconds prior. It was the voice of the Alpha King. Do not step beyond the iron gates. Let no one but my guard into this hall. Roger, please, Ariana pleaded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The scent of her former pack was riding the wind, a foul mixture of stale blood and wet rot. Alpha KL is ruthless. He will not leave without a body. Give me to them. It is the only way to spare your pack. Roger turned back to her. The sheer force of his presence seemed to dim the sconces on the walls. He reached out, his large hand cupping her cheek. His skin was blazing hot against the chill of the foyer. They abandoned you to the ice, Ariana, he said, his tone dangerously soft. The only bodies Alpha Kale will leave with tonight will be his own. Watch from the high window if you must. But know this, you belong to the winter now. He turned on his heel, his massive black fur mantle billowing behind him. As he pushed open the heavy oak doors, the blizzard roared into the hall, swallowing him in a vortex of white. Ariana did not retreat to her room. She could not. Driven by a terror she couldn't suppress, she raced up the grand curving staircase, her soft leather boots silent against the stone. She reached the highest clerestory window overlooking the jagged pass that led to the citadel. Below, the The snow was bathed in the harsh, blue light of the moon. A sea of torches flickered at the edge of the tree line. The Blood Iron Pack had come in full force. At their helm stood Alpha Kyle. Even from this distance, Ariana could feel the greasy, oppressive weight of his dominance. He was a brute of a man, wide and scarred, radiating malicious intent. Kyle shouted something into the wind, pointing a thick, gloved finger at the citadel doors. He was demanding his property. He was demanding her. Then, the heavy oak doors of the citadel opened. Roger walked out alone. He did not bring his guards. He did not carry a weapon. He simply strode into the knee-deep snow, his dark clothing a stark void against the blinding white. The wind howled, whipping the snow into a frenzy, but around Roger, the storm seemed to hesitate. He stopped a dozen yards from the Blood Iron vanguard. Ariana pressed her hands against the freezing glass, her breath misting the pain. Her inner wolf was pacing frantically, whining high in her chest, terrified for the man who smelled of ozone and pine. Kale sneered, stepping forward to bridge the gap. Ariana saw his lips move in a taunt, saw the arrogant thrust of his chest. He shifted, his body expanding, bones cracking as he took on his wolf form, a large, heavily muscled beast with a coat of dirty, matted rust. Kale's wolves followed suit, a dozen of his best fighters dropping to all fours, snarling and snapping their jaws. Roger stood perfectly still. He did not assume a fighting stance. He merely tilted his head, watching the snarling pack with an expression of profound boredom. Then, the Alpha King unleashed his aura. It wasn't a physical strike, but Ariana felt the shockwave reverberate against the glass of her window. It was a pressure drop so severe it made her ears pop. The scent of the impending thunderstorm multiplied tenfold, suffocating the stench of the Blood Iron Pack. Roger didn't just shift. He exploded into the night. The transformation was instantaneous. One moment, a man stood in the snow. The next, the colossal midnight black dire wolf materialized. He was a nightmare forged from shadows and starlight, dwarfing Kale's wolf entirely. His golden eyes burned like twin suns in the blizzard. Roger let out a roar. It wasn't a howl. It was the sound of a mountain fracturing, a primal, earth-shattering vibration that rolled down the valley and shook the snow from the high peaks. Kale's vanguard immediately dropped to their bellies, whimpering as their instincts overrode their loyalty. Kale himself hesitated, the rust-colored fur along his spine standing on end. But arrogance made Kale foolish. He lunged. It was over in 3 seconds. Roger moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He sidestepped Kale's snapping jaws, his own jaws clamping down on the back of Kale's thick neck. With a brutal, fluid twist of his head, Roger slammed the Blood Iron Alpha into the frozen earth. The sickening crack of bone echoed all the way up to Ariana's window. Roger pinned Kale to the ground, his massive paws pressing into the defeated Alpha's spine. The giant black wolf looked up, his golden eyes locking onto the trembling Blood Iron Pack. He released a low, continuous growl that promised absolute annihilation. If a single paw stepped forward, no one moved. The Blood Iron wolves slowly backed away, their tails tucked securely between their legs. Roger released Kale, kicking the broken, bleeding wolf away in disgust. He did not kill him. He let Kale limp back to his retreating pack, a humiliating message sent back to the lowlands. The winter born does not yield. Ariana let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees trembling so violently she nearly collapsed. He had won. He had protected her. But as Roger shifted back into his human form in the snow, Ariana saw him stumble. His hand flew to his side, pressing hard against his ribs. Dark, almost black blood seeped between his fingers, staining the pristine snow. Kale had managed one desperate strike before he fell. And as the Alpha King looked up at her window, his storm-gray eyes dimming with pain, Ariana knew the true cost of her sanctuary. The heavy oak doors of Roger's private chambers groaned in protest as Ariana pushed them open. The room was suffocatingly hot, the massive hearth ablaze with thick logs that crackled and popped, sending showers of golden sparks up the stone chimney. Roger sat heavily on the edge of the massive, fur-draped bed. He had stripped off his ruined tunic, leaving his upper body bare to the firelight. A jagged, ragged tear ran across his lower ribs, a deep claw mark from Kale that was bleeding sluggishly, the edges of the wound dark and inflamed. Usually, an alpha's healing factor would knit the skin together in a matter of minutes. But the Blood Iron Pack coated their claws in nightshade before battle, a cowardly, toxic tactic meant to slow the healing of stronger opponents. Ariana stood in the doorway, a basin of steaming water and a bundle of clean linen in her trembling hands. The scent of his blood, rich, metallic, and heavy with the smell of scorched earth, made her inner wolf whine with distress. "I told you to stay with the betas, Ariana," Roger grunted, his voice tight with pain. He didn't look up, his jaw clenched as he pressed a blood-soaked rag against his side. "The betas are afraid of your temper right now," Ariana said softly, stepping fully into the room and closing the heavy door behind her with a definitive click. "And your wound is poisoned. It will not close on its own." Roger finally lifted his head. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and the storm gray of his eyes was clouded, feverish. He watched her approach, every muscle in his massive body coiled tight, fighting the instinct to lash out at the pain. "You should not be here," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "An injured alpha is volatile. My wolf is agitated." "I am not afraid of your wolf," Ariana replied, and to her shock, she realized it was the absolute truth. She walked to his side, placing the basin on the heavy wooden nightstand. She didn't ask for permission. Operating on a primal, deeply ingrained Omega instinct, she reached out and gently moved his large, bloody hand away from the wound. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt of pure electricity snapped between them. Roger sucked in a sharp breath, his entire body going rigid. The heat radiating off his skin was phenomenal, burning through her thin woolen dress, but it wasn't just the heat of his fever. It was the sudden, overwhelming spike in his scent. The ozone and pine deepened, wrapping around her like a physical blanket, possessive and all-consuming. Ariana's own scent, a quiet, subdued note of winter rose and vanilla that she had suppressed for years to hide from her abusers, suddenly bloomed. It filled the hot air of the chamber, sweet and desperately soothing. She dipped the linen into the hot water, wringing it out before pressing it gently against the poisoned laceration. Roger flinched, a deep guttural growl vibrating in his chest. "Shh," Ariana murmured, her voice entirely devoid of the trembling fear she usually harbored. She leaned closer, her breath brushing across his scarred collarbone. "Let me help you. You bled for me today." Roger's hands, large enough to crush her skull with a squeeze, curled into fists against the furs of the bed to keep from grabbing her. He stared down at her, his eyes tracking the delicate curve of her neck, the dark silk of her hair falling over her shoulder. "I would bleed 1,000 times, he whispered hoarsely, "before I let them touch you again." Ariana's hand stuttered against his skin. She looked up, her heart catching in her throat. The distance between them had vanished. She was standing perfectly between his spread knees, leaning over him. If she moved an inch, her chest would brush against his. The air in the room grew unsustainably thick. The crackle of the fire seemed to fade, replaced entirely by the thunderous, synchronized rhythm of their heartbeats. She carefully cleaned the nightshade from the wound, her small, scarred fingers tracing the hard ridges of his abdominal muscles. As she worked, she felt the tension slowly drain from his frame. The dark, inflamed edges of the claw mark began to turn a healthy pink, his alpha healing finally kicking in now that the poison was cleared. But Roger's breathing didn't slow. It grew heavier, shallower. Ariana finished wiping away the blood. She reached for a dry bandage, but before she could grasp it, Roger's hand shot out. His grip on her wrist was lightning fast, but incredibly gentle. He didn't squeeze the old, faded scars left by her former pack. He just held her, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin over her pulse point. "Ariana," he breathed, the word a desperate prayer. He pulled her forward. She didn't resist. She let herself fall into his chest, her hands coming up to rest flat against his blazing, bare shoulders. Roger wrapped his massive arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent of winter rose and vanilla as if it were oxygen. Her inner wolf didn't whimper. It sang. It howled a beautiful, uninhibited song of recognition. "Mate." The realization crashed through her, staggering in its magnitude. The alpha king of the Winterborn, the most feared, solitary predator in the north, was her fated mate. Roger groaned, a sound of profound relief and agonizing restraint. He pressed a searing, open-mouthed kiss to the juncture of her neck and shoulder, sending a shockwave of heat straight to her core. But just as Ariana melted against him, ready to surrender entirely to the bond, Roger abruptly went rigid. He tore himself away from her, his chest heaving as he stood up from the bed, putting a necessary 10 feet between them. He turned his back to her, gripping the stone mantle of the fireplace so hard his knuckles turned white. "Roger?" she whispered, the sudden coldness in the room chilling her to the bone. "What's wrong? You must go to your chambers," he commanded, the icy, royal authority returning to his tone, though it was strained, fraying at the edges. "But the bond," she stammered, confusion and fresh rejection welling in her chest. "You feel it too. I know you do." Roger bowed his head, the shadows of the firelight dancing across the scars on his back. "I feel it, Ariana. More than you could possibly know." He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp and devastating in the dim light. "But you do not know the laws of this mountain. You do not know the curse of the ice crown. To claim you is to damn you." He refused to look at her. "Leave. Before my wolf decides it doesn't care about your freedom." The citadel felt larger, emptier, and immeasurably colder in the days that followed. Roger had withdrawn entirely. He ensured Ariana was fed, clothed in the finest furs, and protected by his most elite betas, but he remained a phantom. She would catch glimpses of him stalking the battlements at night, a dark silhouette against the moon, or hear the terrifying, lonely roar of his wolf echoing through the jagged peaks before dawn. The physical distance was an agony. The mating bond, having been struck awake in the heat of his bedchamber, now hummed in Ariana's blood like a live wire. It demanded proximity. It demanded completion. Unable to bear the suffocating silence of her room, Ariana began to explore the deeper, forgotten levels of the fortress. The citadel was older than she had realized, its foundations carved by wolves long before written history. On the third night of his absence, she wandered into a massive, circular chamber deep beneath the main hall. The air here smelled of old dust and ancient magic. Moonlight spilled through a high, domed skylight, illuminating a series of massive stone tablets set into the walls. They were carved with runes, the ancient language of the first shifters. "They tell the history of the Winterborn." A quiet voice echoed in the chamber. Ariana jumped, turning to see an elderly woman leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. It was Alara, the pack's elder seer and healer. She had eyes like clouded glass and a scent like dried sage and parchment. "I cannot read them," Ariana admitted softly, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Few can," Alara replied, shuffling closer. She raised a gnarled hand, tracing the deepest grooves of a tablet depicting a massive wolf wearing a crown of jagged ice. "But you must know their meaning, child. If you are to understand our king's torment." Ariana stepped closer, her heart beating a nervous rhythm. "He said claiming me would damn me. He spoke of a curse." Alara sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "The Winterborn is the oldest pack in existence. We guard the boundary between the living world and the dead peaks. The magic of this mountain is feral, violent. To rule it, an alpha must take the ice crown into his soul." The old woman turned her clouded eyes toward Ariana. "The crown grants the Alpha King immeasurable power. You saw what he did to the Blood Iron Alpha. He is a god among wolves. But the magic is cold. It freezes the heart. It drives the Alpha to madness. A slow, isolating insanity born of pure ice." Ariana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Is there no cure?" "There is an anchor," Alara corrected gently. "A fated mate. A true Omega whose warmth can melt the frost encroaching on the king's soul. When Roger recognized you in the snow, his wolf knew its salvation had arrived." "Then why did he pull away?" Ariana cried, frustration bleeding into her voice. "If I can save him, why does he lock himself in the dark?" Alara's expression grew deeply sorrowful. "Because, child, the mountain is jealous. If the Alpha King completes the mating bond, the magic of the territory binds the mate to the citadel, forever." Ariana stared at the rune of the crowned wolf, the truth sinking in like a heavy stone. "If he bites you, if he claims you as his Luna, you will never be able to cross the borders of the Winterborn again," Alara explained quietly. "The cold will become your permanent home, Roger knows you were a prisoner of the Blood Iron Pack. You have never tasted true freedom. To claim you to save his own mind, he views it as putting you in a new, albeit kinder, cage. Tears pricked Ariana's eyes. Roger wasn't rejecting her out of disgust or arrogance. He was dying a slow, agonizing death of the mind, and he was choosing that death rather than stealing her freedom. It was a level of sacrifice and love she had never comprehended, a stark contrast to the cruelty she had known all her life. "He thinks I want to run," Ariana whispered to the dark stone room. She turned away from the tablets, a sudden, fierce heat igniting in her chest. The timid, broken Omega who had waited to die in the snow was gone. In her place stood a woman whose blood hummed with the power of a dormant Luna. She didn't run to her chambers. She marched straight up the winding stairs, past the bewildered guards, and up to the highest tower of the citadel. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to the battlements. The wind whipped her dark hair violently around her face. Roger stood at the edge of the parapet, staring out over the dark expanse of the forest. He looked exhausted. His broad shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his black fur mantle. He didn't turn around as she approached, though the sudden rigidity of his spine told her he knew exactly who it was. "I told you to keep to the lower halls, Ariana. The wind up here will freeze your lungs." His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. Ariana stepped up beside him. She looked out at the vast, terrifying emptiness of the world below. Then, she looked up at the man who had pulled her from the abyss. "You think the world out there is freedom," she said, her voice cutting clearly through the howling wind. "You think because it is vast, it is liberating." Roger finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes heavy with torment. "You deserve the sun, Ariana. You deserve to walk in green fields, far from the blood and the ice. I will not cage you here to save myself." Ariana took a step closer, entirely unbothered by the freezing gale. She reached up, her small hands grasping the heavy lapels of his black fur mantle. "The green fields were my prison," she told him, her eyes locking onto his with unwavering intensity. "The lowlands brought me nothing but pain, starvation, and beatings. Freedom isn't a place, Roger." She rose slightly on her toes, closing the agonizing distance between them. "Freedom," she whispered, her breath mixing with his, "is choosing who you belong to." Before Roger could process her words, the heavy iron door of the battlements slammed open against the stone wall. 3 massive wolves, deeply scarred and bristling with hostility, stalked onto the roof. They were not Roger's loyal guards. They were the elders of the Winterborn High Council, and their eyes were fixed on Ariana with lethal intent. "An outpack Omega will not bear the ice crown," the lead wolf snarled, his voice a guttural scrape of rock against rock. "The council demands the trial of the frost. If she fails, the mountain claims her." The air on the battlements shattered. Roger did not shift, but the violent displacement of oxygen as his alpha aura exploded outward was enough to send the 3 elders skidding backward on the frosted stone. "You dare bring the trial to my mate?" Roger's voice wasn't a roar. It was a deadly, seismic vibration that rattled the iron hinges of the heavy door. His storm gray eyes had bled entirely into a terrifying molten gold. The lead elder, an ancient wolf whose fur was entirely white with age and frost, lowered his head but did not submit. "She is no mate, Alpha King. She is unmarked, an interloper from the lowlands. The ancient laws dictate that any unbonded wolf seeking sanctuary within the citadel's highest walls must prove their worth to the mountain." "I am the mountain," Roger snarled, taking a massive step forward, positioning his body entirely between Ariana and the elders. The heat radiating off him was blinding, a physical wall of protective fury. "You are its king, but you are not its soul," the elder countered, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure of Roger's anger. "If you refuse the trial, you forfeit the crown. The magic will fracture. The pack will tear itself apart." Ariana stared at the broad expanse of Roger's back. He was trembling. The muscles beneath his tunic were coiled so tightly they looked ready to snap. He was preparing to slaughter his own council. He was preparing to destroy his kingdom, just to keep her safe. He had saved her from the snow. He had bled for her. He was dying a slow death of the mind to preserve her freedom. It was her turn to protect him. She reached out, her small, pale hand laying gently over the rigid muscles of his forearm. The touch was a drop of cool water on a raging iron forge. Roger gasped, his head snapping back to look at her, the golden fire in his eyes warring with a desperate panic. No, he whispered to her, shaking his head. No, the trial is death. It is a sealed cavern deep within the glacier. No heat, no furs, only the ice. I survived the ice once, Roger, she said softly, her thumb stroking his skin. You barely survived the snow, he argued, his voice breaking. This is the deep frost. It stops the heart in minutes. I will not allow it. Ariana stepped out from behind him, facing the elders. The wind tore at her crimson wool dress, but she kept her chin high. Her inner wolf, once a cowering shadow, stood tall, fueled by the impossible gravity of the alpha beside her. I accept the trial, she declared. Her voice did not waver. Ariana! Stop! Roger reached for her, but the ancient magic of the mountain, triggered by her verbal acceptance, suddenly surged. A deafening crack echoed through the stone beneath their feet. The shadows around the battlements lengthened, twisting unnaturally until they formed a swirling vortex of deep, suffocating blue light. It smelled of ancient dust, deep water, and absolute unforgiving zero. The elders bowed their heads. The mountain has heard. The portal to the deep frost is open. Roger threw himself forward, attempting to grab her waist and pull her back, but the vortex flared, creating a barrier of solid magical ice between them. He slammed his fists against it, the sound of bone-striking impenetrable frost echoing across the roof. Ariana? His roar was pure, unadulterated agony. Don't do this. She placed her hands against the other side of the magical barrier. She could feel the staggering cold radiating from the vortex behind her, sinking its teeth into her spine. But she kept her eyes fixed on his. I told you, she whispered, mouthing the words through the ice as the vortex began to pull her backward. Freedom is choosing who you belong to. I choose you. The blue light consumed her, blinding and silent. The world of stone and storm vanished. When Ariana opened her eyes, she was in a tomb. The cavern was perfectly circular, carved from flawless, translucent blue glacier ice. There was no light source, yet the walls emitted a faint, ghostly luminescence. The air was so incredibly cold that it didn't feel like temperature. It felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. She took a breath. The air crystallized in her throat, a sharp, agonizing laceration that made her cough violently. Her wool dress offered absolutely zero protection. Within seconds, the moisture in her eyes began to freeze. The trial is to survive until dawn. The lead elder's voice echoed in her memory. Dawn was hours away. An ordinary human, even an ordinary shifter without a thick winter coat, would perish in this cavern in under 20 minutes. Ariana sank to her knees, the smooth ice biting through her skirts. The numbness, the old, familiar predator that had stalked her in the woods, rushed back to claim her. It started in her toes, racing up her calves, paralyzing her fingers. She closed her eyes. The terrifying quiet of the cave magnified the sound of her own slowing heartbeat. Thump. Pause. Thump. She was an orphaned Omega. She had no pack magic to draw from. She had no alpha to project his heat over her. She was alone in the deep frost. But as the lethargy of freezing sank into her brain, whispering sweet promises of eternal sleep, a sudden, sharp scent cut through the sterile smell of the ice. Ozone. Wood smoke. Winter pine. It wasn't in the cave. It was in her mind. Ariana's eyes snapped open. The mating bond. She hadn't been bitten. The bond wasn't complete, but it was awake. She pressed her hands over her heart. Beneath her freezing ribs, a tiny, defiant spark flickered. It was the piece of Roger's soul that had reached out to hers when she had cleaned his wounds. It was the fierce, protective fire of the Alpha King. You are not nothing. His voice resonated in the darkness. The moment the snow laid you at my feet, you became everything. Ariana let out a shuddering breath. She didn't try to curl into a ball to conserve heat. She sat up straight. She closed her eyes, ignoring the agonizing bite of the frost, and focused entirely on that single spark in her chest. I am not alone, she thought fiercely. I am the Luna of the Winterborn. She pulled on the bond. It wasn't a physical tether, but an emotional conduit. She pushed all her love, all her fierce, desperate desire to save Roger from his curse, down the invisible wire. In response, a floodgate opened. The spark in her chest erupted into an inferno. The heat didn't come from the outside. It bloomed from her marrow. It was the magic of the Omega, the unique, powerful ability to anchor and soothe an alpha's volatile energy. But instead of soothing, Ariana weaponized it. She took the raw, blistering heat of Roger's distant panic and channeled it through her own soul. The freezing air in her lungs turned to steam. Outside the vortex chamber, the citadel was tearing itself apart. Roger had destroyed the doors to the council hall. He had battered the elders into submission, leaving them broken and bleeding on the stone floors. But the magic of the trial was ancient, woven into the bedrock by the first ancestors. No physical force could shatter the glacier portal until the sun crested the peaks. He paced the grand hall, a monstrous silhouette of absolute rage. His storm-gray eyes were gone, replaced permanently by the molten gold of a predator whose mate was in mortal danger. His chest heaved with every breath, the scent of burning ozone so thick the tapestries on the walls were beginning to singe. The ice crown, the ancient curse in his blood that usually demanded stoicism and cold isolation, was warring violently with his wolf. The crown demanded he remain a king of ice. His wolf demanded he burn the world to ash to reach his mate. She is dying, his wolf howled in his mind. The frost is taking her. Roger dropped to his knees, his massive hands gripping his hair. The mental agony was worse than any physical wound. He could feel the connection they shared fraying at the edges, the cold encroaching on the tiny, fragile thread of their bond. Please, the Alpha King whispered to the unfeeling stone, a prayer from a monster who had never bowed to anything. Take the crown. Take my life. Give her back. Deep within the glacier, Ariana was unaware of the king's bargains. She was locked in a battle of wills against the mountain itself. The cavern of ice pushed inward with a suffocating, lethal pressure. It was an ancient entity, testing the structural integrity of her soul. But the heat inside her was growing. Her skin began to emit a faint, pearlescent glow in the pitch-black cave. The scent of winter roses and rich vanilla thickened, combating the sterile smell of the frost. The ice directly beneath her knees began to hiss. A puddle formed. Then, a slow, trickling stream. Ariana's eyes were closed. Her face turned upward, lost entirely in the overwhelming sensation of the bond. She could feel Roger's terror, his earth-shattering grief. She pulled harder on the tether, sending a wave of absolute calm and blistering warmth back to him. I am here, she projected into the void, her inner wolf singing a powerful, resonant note that vibrated through the glacier. I am burning for you. The temperature in the cavern skyrocketed. The translucent blue walls began to weep. Jagged stalactites of ice that had hung untouched for millennia snapped and crashed to the floor, instantly melting into steaming pools of water. The mountain, a sentient force of nature, recoiled in shock. It had expected a weak, broken Omega to quietly succumb. It had not anticipated a queen possessing a heart capable of holding the sun. The air grew thick with fog as the ice sublimated into steam. Ariana opened her eyes. The cavern was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary of swirling mist and heat. The oppressive weight of the cold vanished, replaced by a strange, humming vibration in the walls. The mountain was not angry. It was yielding. Suddenly, a sliver of brilliant, blinding gold pierced the darkness above. The sun had breached the horizon. The dawn had arrived. The magic sealing the cavern shattered like cheap glass. A massive explosion of force ripped the roof of the cavern away. Sunlight and fresh, biting mountain air rushed in. Through the clearing steam, a massive shadow descended. Roger hit the floor of the cavern with the force of a meteor, the stone cracking beneath his boots. He had torn through the physical rock of the mountain the moment the magic barrier dropped, his bare hands bloody and torn from the sheer desperation of his digging. He froze, his chest heaving, his golden eyes wide with terror as he frantically searched the mist for her body. He expected to find a frozen corpse. Instead, the fog parted. Ariana sat in the center of a wide, steaming pool of water, the only melted spot in the heart of the eternal glacier. Her dark hair was damp with sweat, her cheeks flushed with a vibrant, impossible heat. She looked up at him, a tired but infinitely tender smile curving her lips. I told you, she whispered, her voice a little raspy but entirely alive. I am not afraid of the winter. Roger let out a sound that was half sob, half roar. He crossed the cavern in a single bound, falling to his knees in the shallow water. He hauled her into his chest, crushing her against him with a desperation that stole the breath from her lungs. He buried his face in her neck, his massive frame shaking violently. He was inhaling her scent, mapping the steady, strong beat of her pulse with his lips, proving to his terrified wolf that she was real, that she was warm. "You're burning!" He gasped against her skin, his tears mixing with the dampness of her hair. "How are you burning?" "Because you gave me the spark," she replied softly, her arms wrapping tightly around his broad shoulders. "The mountain demanded a queen of ice, but the winterborn needs a heart of fire." Roger pulled back just enough to look at her face. The molten gold in his eyes was slowly receding, giving way to the brilliant, stormy gray she loved so much. The madness of the ice crown, the cold isolation that had haunted his gaze for decades, was entirely gone, melted away by the sheer force of her survival. "Ariana," he breathed, his voice a low, reverent rumble. He reached up, his rough thumbs gently tracing her jawline. He looked down at the pale, sensitive curve of her neck, the junction of her shoulder, where the mating mark belonged. "The mountain accepts you," he whispered, his gaze darkening with a primal, possessive hunger that made Ariana's pulse hammer. "The curse is broken. You are free to leave, if you wish." Ariana didn't hesitate. She tilted her head to the side, baring her throat to him. "I am already home," she said. "Claim me, my king." A low, vibrating growl tore from Roger's throat, a sound of absolute surrender and total victory. He didn't need to be told twice. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her from the shallow pool of melted ice as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her flush against his chest, the heat radiating between them a physical, tangible force. His lips brushed over her pulse point. The sensation was electric, a searing anticipation that made Ariana gasp and arch into him. "Mine," Roger rumbled, his voice dropping into the ancient cadence of the first wolves. "My heart, my Luna." He opened his jaws. Ariana felt the sharp prick of his canines against her skin, and then a sudden, blinding rush of pain as he bit down. She cried out, but the pain lasted only a fraction of a second before it was entirely consumed by an explosion of pure, unadulterated warmth. The mating bond, previously a thin, hopeful wire connecting their souls, became a massive, unbreakable chain of iron and fire. The magic of the bite flooded her veins. She felt Roger's strength, his ancient power, his terrifying capacity for violence, and his overwhelming, desperate love for her all at once. Simultaneously, Roger gasped against her neck. The deep, agonizing freeze that had gripped his soul for a century, the curse of the ice crown shattered. The warmth of her Omega spirit washed over his mind, a soothing, maternal tide that healed the frozen cracks in his sanity. When he finally pulled back, slowly dragging his tongue over the bleeding mark to seal it with his saliva, the air around them physically shifted. The mountain rumbled. It wasn't a sound of anger, but a deep, resonant hum of acknowledgement. The magical pressure that constantly hung over the citadel, demanding stoicism and cruelty, evaporated. Roger looked down at her. His storm-gray eyes were clear, bright, and filled with a peace she had never seen before. The harsh, severe lines of his aristocratic face softened into an expression of sheer adoration. "My queen," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. Ariana reached up, her fingers tracing the silver scars on his cheek. "We should go back," she smiled gently. "I think the elders need a healer." Roger let out a short, genuine laugh, a sound so foreign yet so beautiful that it made Ariana's chest ache with joy. "They will live, but they will learn to bow to a new law today." He carried her out of the shattered cavern, stepping from the deep frost back into the halls of the citadel. As they walked, the very stone seemed to change. The oppressive shadows lifted, the bitter chill in the corridors retreated, replaced by a comfortable, ambient warmth. When they reached the grand foyer, the heavy oak doors were open to the morning sun. The pack was waiting. Hundreds of wolves, betas, and guards stood in the courtyard. They had felt the shift in the mountain's magic. They had felt the curse break. As Roger emerged into the sunlight, carrying Ariana in his arms, the entire pack dropped to their knees in perfect unison. There was no fear in their submission, There was only reverence and a profound, collective sigh of relief. Ariana looked out over the sea of bowed heads, the snowy peaks glittering like diamonds against the bright blue sky. She was no longer the broken, orphaned Omega left to freeze in the dark. She was the Luna of the Winterborn. She was the fire that had thawed the mountain. Roger shifted his grip, holding her securely as he looked out over his people. He didn't project a terrifying aura of dominance. He didn't need to. The quiet, unshakable strength of a king whole and healed radiated from him. He looked down at his mate, the woman who had defied the ancient laws of the earth to save him. Let the lowlands keep their cruelty. Roger's voice echoed across the courtyard, clear and absolute. The winter has found its heart. The legends of the north changed that day. The Winterborn was no longer a pack ruled by the terrifying isolation of the Ice Crown. Instead, it became a sanctuary of fierce protection and unyielding warmth, guided by the Alpha King who commanded the storm, and the Omega Queen who held the sun in her chest. Ariana, once an outcast left to die in the snow, found her destiny not in the fragile safety of the green lowlands, but in the heart of the deepest frost, proving that true power isn't the absence of feeling, but the courage to love despite the cold. If you felt the heat of the Winterborn, hit that like button. Share this story with fellow romance lovers. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic shifter tales.